Good morning. I'm Sonia from the IED, and I had the absolute pleasure of moderating a rather challenging session. The role of joint evaluations as a tool for boosting development effectiveness at country systems, post pandemic context, and the case studies of joint evaluations in Bahrain, one from a global evaluation facility, and the other from a project in Nepal. A couple of issues that the panel participants converged on: a joint evaluation approach paper that was a good practice that was followed everywhere through all the joint evaluations, which discussed priorities, optimize the timelines, which were the methodologies, and on convergence on methodologies and approaches between the um, donors. Um, Focus on not to contest but to leverage, not to attribute, no attribution but contribution. A lot of focus on triangulation. Um, it is clearly a value addition from the perspective of force multipliers. Team building takes time, but navigating organizational mandates brings teams together. And of course, the evaluation approach paper looks at different timelines as well as different audiences and priorities. So all of those can be brought together and addressed, and to make the implementation of the evaluation as smooth as possible. The challenge from a government perspective is that they are the source of data, but they are also the source of information. And here there's a bunch of donors converging to, from that one data source, which requires some donor coordination, both from the government side as well as from the donor side. So that was a challenge that was overcome by ironing out this approach at the very beginning of the evaluation stage. Last word.
Given this is the first session, we will give a couple more minutes for people to come in, but it's going to eat into a question and answer session. So we will start in about a minute, if that's okay. Here? Louder. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Ah, okay.
Mic check.
So we'll start in a minute. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let us begin. Uh, Let me start by introducing myself as a moderator and then also the panelists. I am Nanti Kesan. I'm a lead evaluator at the Independent Office of Evaluation at IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And I have 25 years of evaluation and development experience. I head the thematic and corporate level evaluations at IOE. Recently, I concluded a evaluation of IFAD's support to smallholder adaptation. Also, I want to let you know that today I'm going to be the minister for most marginalized people in the world, the global ministry. And I'm going to ask our colleagues to provide evidence to support the idea why we should green our policies. In 1972, in the Stockholm Conference, late Indira Gandhi famously quoted, "The worst polluters are the poverty and the needs." And it is not to say that there is a zero-sum game going on there, but it is to show that every dollar we invest in this urgent need has to bear fruit. Otherwise, it's going to cost the poor. So in order for us to make sure that we make the best out of these investments that we make in this urgent priority, we have to be sure that it is going to work. So this whole session is organized around understanding, are there successful green efforts? It could be at the policy level or country level. What are the challenges to getting on about there? And also, as evaluators going forward, what are the things that we should do in order to make sure that the green policies are supported and thriving? So we will structure the discussion around 3 questions. And then after each question, we will invite 2 comments. And then we will open the floor to everyone. So there'll be question 1, followed by inviting comments from you. We will select 2 comments initially. You can always ask questions later on. But just to get the discussion going on and everyone to get engaged with what we are doing. And then question 2, followed by 2 questions, and then question 3, and open the floor. That'll be the structure of the meeting. I hope it is clear. Okay? And let me start by introducing my neighbor here, Sven Harten. He is the Deputy Director at DEVAL, German Institute for Development Evaluation, and he leads the work on methods and standards as well as evaluation capacity development in DEVAL. He holds a PhD in political science from London School of Economics and has more than 20 years of experience and done more than 50 evaluations. His current main focus relates to climate responses, energy, financial cooperation, as well as evaluation criteria, quality, and standards. Previously, Sven worked at the World Bank, IFC, the European Commission, along with other assignments. He lived more than 10 years in Africa and Latin America. And after that, you see Daisuke Horikoshi, and he is a principal evaluation officer at the Independent Evaluation Unit of Green Climate Fund. His experience includes 10 years as country specialist for Pacific countries and resident representative in Afghanistan and Papua New Guinea for Japanese government's development agencies. At IEU GCF, he has co-managed the first performance review of GCF and led a number of independent evaluations and currently evaluating GCF's investments in the energy sector. He is also overseeing IUE's evaluation capacity building activities for GCF stakeholders. Next to him is Shimako Takahashi. She is an evaluation specialist at the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank. She specializes in rural resilience and natural resources management, including agro-ecosystem and forest management. She has experience in managing projects and conducting evaluations. Before joining ADB, she worked for the United Nations University, FAO, UNDP Vietnam, and JICA. Shimako holds a PhD in biological sciences from Tokyo University of Science and master's degree in environmental management from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And next to him is Anupam Anand. He is a Senior Evaluation Officer at Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environmental Facility, with more than 15 years of combined experience in evaluation, international development, and academia. He has led evaluations on a range of themes, including biodiversity, nature-based solutions, and land degradation. He's an expert in geospatial analysis, climate change diagnostics, computational social science, drones, and field-based techniques for problem solving and evidence gathering. Before joining the IEO, Anupam was a remote sensing scientist at the University of Maryland, working on NASA-funded projects. He has published over 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on remote sensing, ecology, sustainable development, land cover change, and environmental policy. Anupam holds a PhD in geospatial science from the University of Maryland. So you are in good hands with the collective experience over a century to answer the questions that we have. So let me pose the first question to the panelists. So they have to convince us, the most marginalized. Evaluative evidence of successful green policies to address climate change and its consequences. Do you see evaluative evidence of successful green policies to address climate change and its consequences? Over to Sven first.
All right, colleagues, good morning. Thanks for coming here last day, first session. Speaking on behalf of all of us, we appreciate that you come here, and I think we promise to make your time worthwhile. I personally promise also to be a bit thought-provoking for us as evaluators, but that's just a cliffhanger for the end. Even though I promised not to have slides, since my colleagues went ahead, I felt some peer pressure. So this is not AI generated, but last minute. So thanks so much to the Secretariat, to Michelle, that she accommodated some really last minute submissions. Excellent job from the Secretariat. So I'm talking from a German bilateral perspective. First thing here is Germany's climate-related, and I'm talking about climate-related, not green. So green is even bigger, but climate-related funding, roughly about the last 10 years, if you're looking 2011, 2022, is about $20 billion in total. So that's for one bilateral donor, a significant portion, I would say. What you see here in the figure is interesting, because even though, and that's part of the good news, what is working, answering the question, Germany fulfilled its commitment, what it stated, what it would do, namely by 2020 having about 4 billion per year annual spending. So from 2020 onwards, it's 4 billion euros. I need to say this is US, but the target is euros per year. However, what you see there, the blue bars is overall ODA spending. So even though the climate-related funding, the target was met, it didn't go quite up in proportion to general ODA spending. That's just, doesn't move forward. Oops. And then another important thing that for German strategy, and it's part of the reason why I'm here, is increasing funding through multilateral organizations. So some of you working with trust funds know that there are some significant German contributions. We saw that there were, in the last 10 years, roughly 2.5 billion core contributions and 2.4 billion earmark contributions in total. This is not annual, right? While those figures may seem large, overall, related to the overall German budget, multilateral spending is still a minority of what Germany does. So unfortunately, the big part is still small bilateral things. But at least we see sort of increasing bilateral, multilateral commitments and increasing engagement. So, but my real answer to your question, Nanti, is what we saw in our evaluation that we did for the past almost 5 years, 5 evaluation reports. It's a modular evaluation on climate change adaptation. What really works is technical assistance to support national adaptation plans and national determined contributions. So for those of you who are not that familiar with the climate space, basically both documents are policy documents. One is on the adaptation side, as the name says, and the other one is on the mitigation side. And they're sort of policy documents that state a country's plan how to work on adaptation and how to reduce basically greenhouse gas emissions. In the past, the problem was that those documents weren't really good. Ambitions were quite low. There was little country ownership. Actually, sort of the donor community played a part because they, last minute, they wrote some of those NAPs when they had to be submitted, like 6-7 years ago that happened. And over the past couple of years, we are seeing sort of a closer engagement with technical assistance, working together with government stakeholders in partner countries, and improve the quality of those documents. So this is one area which we found in our evaluation that actually works, and it may sound a bit trivial, but I mean, in terms of fighting climate change, those are the key policy documents. So if you get them right, you have a chance to move forward. And what we saw, for instance, in the case of Colombia, if it's coupled with policy-based lending, then you're actually seeing sort of also increased better results in terms of reducing emissions. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague.
Thank you, Sven. I just want to echo Sven that we'd like to thank you, Michelle, and the Secretariat colleague who actually accommodate our last minute submission of slide. I know most of us just submit our slide last night. And then and thank you very much for coming this morning session. Likewise, the German government, the Green Climate Fund, which is the financial mechanism under UNFCCC, has a readiness preparatory supports program in addition to our regular funding proposal mechanism. Our readiness program aims to provide resources for strengthening the institutional capacity of national designated authority, which is GCF, focal point of the country, and the direct access entities, which is implementing partner of GCF, to engage with fund more efficiently. The RPSP, Readiness Support Program, has 5 objectives, including supporting capacity building for climate finance coordination and supporting the development of national strategy for climate finance implementation, and supporting national adaptation planning, so-called NAP, and other adaptation planning process. This program also supports in paradigm shift pipeline development for climate change battle and support in knowledge sharing and learning. The program provides up to 1 million per country per year for support-related institutional capacity building, coordination, policy and planning, and programming for investment. It also provides up to $3 million per country, not per year, per country for formulating adaptation plans. This is a quick background of this program. And we, independent evaluation unit of GCF, conducted the evaluation of the program back in 2018. And we are now carrying out another evaluation of the program this year. You will see the result by the end of the year. So today, I just want to share the emerging findings. Although the emerging evidence is still limited in the area of how GCF and how our support green development policies, our evaluation actually found tangible results in some countries on this front through our country case studies. We observed some countries effectively use this GCF's grants to green their development policies. For example, I just want to give my experience. I visited Tonga in this July to see GCF activity in the country. Indeed, Tonga, as a small country, actively uses GCF readiness support while accessing grant almost every year. Tonga, as a small Pacific country, has a national development strategy that prioritizes the increase of renewable energy supply in the country while reducing oil import dependency. However, Tonga has also faced challenges in accessing development finance, as traditional development partners have little space to provide grant aids to this upper middle income country. But at the same time, Tonga's national budget has no room for further external borrowing. In this situation, Tonga has leveraged the readiness support for the climate change battle to link its national development strategy and policy with the climate change agenda and to attract the climate finance from development partners, including GCF and ADB. The ADB and GCF co-finances the installation of large-scale renewable energy plants and battery system in the country. The National Designated Authority of Tonga, which is Climate Division, the focal point of GCF, used the GCF readiness support to develop the National Adaptation Plan, NAP, and the country's climate investment plan that speak to its national development strategy and the development goal. I observed the small climate readiness support by GCF contribute to greening national development policy, where most development partner cannot provide its full support, full-scale, single-country support, technical assistance. GCF could provide in the future for way forward. GCF could provide concessional finance for policy change with a longer-term horizon at scale through its regular funding window beyond the small-scale readiness support. This concludes my first question, answer to the first question. I believe Shimako can share the interesting findings and lesson learned with us from her experience with MDB's policy lending facility. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Independent Evaluation Department of ADB conducted climate evaluation in 2021. So my presentation mainly based on the evaluation experience and also as well as the ongoing processing in the ADB. And let me focus on the Pacific region in my first round. And actually, climate change and disaster risk reduction are closely so interlinked in the Pacific region and cannot be separated each other, where highly exposed different types of natural hazards there, the tsunami or cyclone or volcano, so on. However, Pacific countries, most of the countries have very limited access to finance and also information to make devise suitable adaptation measures. So building disaster risk resilience requires a lot of action, many front action, especially policy, and also strengthen the international arrangement for the disaster risk reduction. So one approach, ADB, the regional approach in the Pacific, the ADB normally takes Pacific region as a region approach. So one program is Pacific Disaster Resilience Program. It's a phased approach, and currently third phase. And two things supports. One is support the policy action in disaster risk management with different countries of the Pacific region. And secondly, it's a new feature at that time for us also to provide a source of contingent financing for timely disaster response and early recovery and reconstruction activities, so that it enables the Pacific countries to have a faster access to fund and also take timely reaction when disaster event happens. So there are a lot of results, but a few examples here I listed from Tuvalu, actually established carried out a pilot basis approval of a Climate Change Resilient Act, and also established a Climate Change Disaster Survival Fund. And we saw another result of this resilience program in Tonga, also made a financial commitment to emerging fund in the national budget, and also school curriculum in Palau. So there are each 16 countries in the Pacific have different needs, but under the Pacific Disaster Resilience Program, those policy action at the different level, actually national different level, took place. So those is one can be transformative and also impactful for the future. And I have one more example from Cambodia, but let me save and probably for next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shimako. And before I begin, I would also join my fellow panelists in thanking the Evaluation Office of the Asian Development Bank for hosting us and exposing us to such brilliant discussions over the last few days. And also thanks to Michelle and the other support staff. And it's an honor to be here. So I'm going to share the experience of one of the evaluations that we conducted on the effectiveness of protected areas. And before I begin, I would like to share what GCF is. So GCF is an example of a multilateral environmental organization. And the mandate of GCF is to serve as the financial mechanism for the 5 major UN environmental conventions. So Convention on Climate, Biodiversity, Land Degradation, Mercury, Persistent Organic Pollutants. So far, GCF has disbursed around $23 billion in grants, and also mobilized around $129 billion as co-finance. And last time we counted, it was around 5,000 projects. That includes national and regional projects that GCF has been implemented or under implementation. So the GCF mandate is to mainstream environmental concerns into policy, practice across sectors. So that's the core aim of the GCF. And in climate, what GCF does is supports both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And as you can see, that there are various sectors within both, and they do overlap as well. So here I'm just going to pick on one example and go deep to explain what does it mean and how GCF has been supporting policy and what are the results. So this is based on the evidence, and we know policy making takes time. It's beyond a project cycle for or a typical GCF project cycle, which is 5 years, to influence policy and for evaluation to see the results. But we do look at the GCF influencing the policy and how that has translated in the results. The advantage we have is that now we have 30 years, almost 30 years of body of work. So many projects that were written off in early stages have kind of come out as a phoenix, and we see some of these examples where when you read the terminal evaluation, they will say, oh, okay, had limited success. And we revisit the project again, and you see that, okay, there's a new law or legislation that came out of the experience of a particular GEF project. So we have this advantage of looking at a large body of work. So that's why I picked protected area, and we know protected areas are very important from multiple purpose, from adaptation purpose, from mitigation potential perspective, and they provide so many livelihood and human benefits. Okay. So what does policy support look like in protected areas? So it could be incentives like payment for ecosystem. So you protect the forest and you will get some incentive to protect the forest. So programs like RED Plus are an example of payment for ecosystem, where you're paid to conserve forests and protect forests. Then policy on national protected areas. So many countries, they do not start with having a robust policy on protected area and protected area systems. So they have promised in the COPs that they would conserve a size of land or water, and they will declare them protected. But you need a whole policy environment to make that happen. So GEF has helped countries come up with protected areas policy and protected area systems. Right now, as we talk, the protected area policy for Iraq is being supported by GEF. So you can see the kind of intervention there. Also, having a land use, land cover plan, for instance, a mining code, so where you can mine and where you cannot mine. So these are the kind of support, and this example is from Colombia. So as evaluators, we're able to see what has been the impact. So now you have the policy, you have policy action, and many of these policies are embedded in the larger program. So policy might be one component of GEF intervention. So what do we see in terms of results? What happened because of these policies? So I'll just give you a quick example from Liberia, and this is post-war Liberia, as you can see here, and you can see the project duration. And when you look at the bottom line, which is all green, you can see that this protected area didn't see any degradation during project period and also beyond. That means the interventions were not just limited to the project area or project timeline, but also sustainable beyond the timelines, whereas at the same time you'll see that in areas adjacent to the protected area and in the entire country, there has been unprecedented forest loss. So if you didn't have this protection, you would have lost all those forests. And this is such a transformational project that it formed the basis of a lot of environmental action in Liberia. So this is just one example, but what we did, we conducted these kind of analysis for all the protected areas, but this is just to give you a sense that what we are looking at. And so we conducted this analysis on 1,200 such protected areas, and what did we see? Did we see any GEF impact of GEF intervention or effectiveness of GEF intervention? And you can see here that in GEF supported protected area, you had much less forest loss. Similarly, in the buffer area, so areas adjacent to the GEF, there also you have less deforestation. And we were able to conduct some quasi-experimental analysis for certain countries where we saw similar results. So the effectiveness was established. So this is because of enabling policy environment and translating those policy into actions. So similarly, we have such evidences coming from various sectors, and as I said, GEF works on not just climate change, but biodiversity, land. So we see the environment or the space in a more integrated way rather than just looking at from a perspective of climate or biodiversity or people. So there are certain other examples from climate renewals or mangroves, dealing with forest fire, pollutions. So and these are available in our various evaluation documents.
Thank you so much. Folks, you heard from two funding mechanisms, a bilateral agency and a multilateral development bank, on what they do to address climate adaptation or mitigation, climate responses in general. And you also heard that a lot of financial support goes into that, maybe not enough, but still it goes there. You also found that some targeting issues, the eval found that they are unable to always target the most vulnerable. At the same time, we also heard from GCF and ADB how they are targeting the most climate vulnerable parts. So we heard also how they are addressing the climate issues through financial and technical support to nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as part of Paris Agreement, and also to help them develop adaptation plans. These are all plans to address and how they would address climate responses. It is, as Anupam pointed out, it is too early. Policies effects take a lot of time. Policies themselves take a lot of time to get into it. But we saw some intermediate, early results, like the school curriculum being integrated, the green integration of considerations in curriculum in Tongo. So these are some of the emerging findings that we are seeing. But at the same time, you will have broader questions, issues about how well these are functioning, how well are we on track about greening the policies of what can we do, what other things can be done, and so on and so forth. So let me take two questions from the audience, if you have, and the panel will try to address them before we proceed to the next question. Over to you, audience. Do I see any hands up? Too early in the morning? Ah. Okay, please.
Good morning. My name is Letila, and I'm from the Ministry of Finance, Fiji. My question is for the... It's on. Sorry, good morning. My name is Letila, and I'm from Ministry of Finance, Fiji. My question is for the Mr. Daisaki from the GCF. You mentioned the challenges that are faced by the Pacific Islands in terms of accessing GCF funding. Knowing that there's challenges faced by these Pacific Island countries and also constraints in the capacity development on climate, in the climate aspect, I would like to ask what are the suggestions or maybe recommendations on how can GCF improve the processes, streamline and simplify the processes so that we can easily access the GCF funding. Thank you.
Christoph Levy Weinmann of Protean Consulting. When I saw the title of this event, of course, I thought we were going to speak about decoupling, right? And about maybe changing our national accounting systems, right, to accommodate those environmental resources, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if the panelists are prepared for that, right? I know climate change is being in an advantageous position because you've got the indicators set, right? And often when we evaluate or when even the teams implement, they forget about the goals, but they just look at the indicators, right? So climate change is very good because we've got those solid measurable indicators that we can even check, and I think Jeff knows that way in a technical way, right? So that's easier, but we have that whole problem with changing to the green economy, yeah, that is sort of left behind, right? So I wonder if any one of the panelists has a view or at least some knowledge, right, on what we're doing in that area.
All right. First to that.
Thank you very much for your question from Fiji. Particularly LDC African states face challenges to access GCF finance because of capacity constraint, also lengthy process of GCF funding approval process. All of our independent evaluation point out that parts. And then the Pacific countries specifically has faced challenges to access GCF because of its capacity constraint and size of country scale. GCF has access modality through direct access entities, which is national access entities who can directly submit the funding proposal to GCF without going through international partners. But our SITS evaluation found that that mechanism doesn't necessarily work well for states because of the lack of national entities, also the limited capacity for national entities. So our evaluation suggests GCF should be more flexible and nimble to accommodate the needs of Pacific countries going through more, for example, regional access, direct access entities. Also, probably one solution is that the Pacific countries can have more regional approach when we submit the funding proposal to GCF. And then the GCF can be more flexible to mobilize its readiness support by taking regional approach, not a single country approach, by the scaling up the size of readiness support to Pacific countries to institutional capacity development and strengthening.
Thank you. Anybody wants to take the second question? Sven, would you like to address the second question?
So I wanted to take the decoupling question. Actually, we will allude to that in the second part of the discussion, where we discuss it as one of the bottlenecks. So we'll come to that in a few minutes.
Yeah, I wanted to say pretty much the same. But also, I agree with you on the indicators for mitigation, right? But not for adaptation. And for both, we still have the challenge of shifting baselines, right? Of really long time horizons. I mean, we looked at sort of 4 or 5 years, but still, I mean, unfortunately, it seems to be that the time horizons are getting shorter, you know, as we all saw perhaps on the news from the horrible events in Libya, right? But so there are still challenges in the measurement. I used to work in access to finance, microfinance, SME finance. And on the banking side, some of the indicators are even better, you know.
All right. So we will move to, there will be plenty of time at the end, I hope, for more questions, but let us move on to the second question. In your view, the challenges or bottlenecks to influence policies to promote climate responses that are identified by your evaluations? We want evidence-based. So some of the bottlenecks are fairly common, but like ministerial coherence and so on and so forth. But both your organizationally or developmentally in countries, what are the bottlenecks that you see to influence the policies? Over. Who wants to take the first?
No, my presentation is already up.
Okay.
Sorry, sorry guys. The minister is calling. Okay. Right. I mean, now we're getting to the fun part as evaluators, right? Criticizing. This is what we can do quite well. So here I brought this map because it actually caused quite some upstir in the German, even in the entire government, but also in the Ministry of Development Cooperation, because we did so first a portfolio review and then an allocation analysis of Germany's ODA spending, and where we found that actually contrary to all strategies, only 20% of commitments of climate finance go to countries with high climate risk. 60% go to countries with low risk, and the rest is sort of medium to high risk. No, medium to low, sorry. So the money doesn't go to the most vulnerable countries. The more vulnerable a country is, yes, the more likely it is to get some funding, right? But with the increased vulnerability, we didn't see any increase in finance. And so if you look at the map, some of you will identify some country where you're coming from. So there was quite some shocking results. And then the other thing is, also I see some colleagues from SIDS in the room. Contrary to the strategy, SIDS have no increased probability to receive commitments from German bilateral or multilateral spending. So this is a huge problem, right? If you want to fight climate change, then and then the other one, and now this is getting perhaps a bit uncomfortable for all of us. Especially for the German evaluation colleagues, but also international. We did an evidence gap map. We did quite some effort to identify evidence. And I must say, the knowledge base on climate change adaptation is poor. And we try to, it's not about only published reports, but it's also about gray literature. I mean, I'm talking specifically about Germany. It's a huge problem, but looking sort of across the board, it's not, considering that in my opinion, this is sort of the biggest crisis for humankind. There is some evidence, but it's not that we're all as evaluators are now running to produce evidence and really focusing on helping to understand what works and what not. And then thirdly, I'm not sure whether I actually have a slide on that. No, I don't. Okay, so just stick with that and keep that in your head, and next time when you see your friends from GIZ, KfW or German embassy, show this to them and use that, right? There is an explanation, but we're talking about sort of solutions in a bit. So now is only the sort of what is not working part. Lastly, in Germany's bilateral cooperation, the idea is to mainstream climate change into all development cooperation. There's been policy documents since 2006 is the first one, and then 10 years later it was updated and made mandatory. On the ground, we don't see any mainstreaming. What is really staggering, what we found, so we selected projects that were sort of from their country context and from the type of intervention, they looked climate change relevant, right? So could be building of a dam, could be sort of building of some other type of infrastructure in investments. And we looked at those projects that didn't have a climate marker, the Rio markers, right? So we looked at projects that were marked as zero, so not as climate relevant. And then we looked at vulnerable countries, and within the countries, vulnerable regions, and identified projects where we said, and we used text mining for that, where sort of we said, well, there must be some relevance to it. And also the guidance from the ministry says that in those contexts, you need to do some vulnerability assessments, climate risk assessment. I need to look up the figure. Only 20% of those projects had that. So 80% of projects of development cooperation which have a high likelihood to being affected by climate change didn't do any risk assessment, didn't talk at all in all project documents and in evaluation reports, so note to us, didn't talk at all about climate change. 80%. Right, so actually, for evaluations, at least for the German context, we even fared worse, because there it's 84%. So 80% of projects didn't talk, and 84% of evaluations. So only 16% of our evaluation colleagues going to the field, going to Sierra Leone perhaps, or going, could be to Toga, to Fiji, right? Going there. Actually, we do have Fiji as an example, that there were German government projects, funded projects, that don't talk about climate change. I mean, how can you do an evaluation in Fiji and not talk about climate change? I mean, how can you do this anywhere in the world? So there's some room for improvement.
Thank you. Please.
I have one quick slide. Yeah, I can share some of emerging findings from our ongoing evaluation of Readiness Program. Again, our evaluation found that LDC and Africa states continue to face the most significant challenges in accessing GCF, not only for GCF regular funding, also even GCF readiness support, which is kind of preparatory support for to access climate finance. Because of their serious capacity constraint. Those countries have the serious capacity constraint to develop the readiness funding proposal for the support and the implementation financial support. So for some key GCF stakeholders, I often observe the application process for readiness support is still over-demanding, costly, time-consuming, and thus disproportionate to the support provided. So GCF need to be more reduced upfront cost for preparation of readiness funding proposal. Also, our evaluation found the GCF readiness support has supported organizational structure and policy for climate change, but since it's the characteristic of readiness funding is 1 year, one shot, grant funding. So that characteristic doesn't match the government system of some countries, especially high turnover rate of country staff. It's challenging to sustain the effectiveness of our readiness support to green development policies. This is the series of emerging findings from our evaluation.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Mary's come. Yeah, I'll get the constraint and bottlenecks, but before that, as a background, just let me touch on briefly about in Cambodia, because this is very interesting cases. Last Pacific Disaster Program, policy-based lending, but this is more TA, Technical Assistance Project. And actually, Cambodia has been very vulnerable to climate change in many ways, but at the same time, the government has shown so commitment to addressing climate change since 1999. And two examples is as just showing the red, and National Adaptation Program Action Plan, NAPA, the government established, and also launched a Strategic National Action Plan for disaster risk reduction in the country. But still, there's a gap between policy initiative at the national level and operating planning and also implementation in particularly key sector like rural development or water resources, agriculture, urban planning, transport. Those are very much gap between the policy and the operation and implementation. So this TA was aimed to provide support to climate change adaptation across 8 ministries in the country, and it was designed to integrate climate with national planning, budgetary, and implementing processes. By that, mainstreaming of climate resilience in operational level would be possible. And that's the main purposes. And flipping around the situation, so constraints actually come out were mainly very much, climate change very much multi-sector approach. But so which means those ministries also need to collaborate and coordinate in a streamlined way. But cross-cutting and also cross-institutional was very much challenging, and but mal-coordination process among the ministries. So that's the main constraints we have seen. And another thing is the institutional capacity development needs. In other words, actually, in our climate evaluation, what's IED, one of the findings is greater, almost, we did a survey with the government and also implementing agency who are in charge of climate change from different sectors, from different countries. But overwhelmingly majority, almost 90–80% of the government, also officials, show the greatest need for support for climate action-oriented policy plus institutional capacity development. So I believe not only one single project, but more blending development tools, policy, climate or green development oriented policy, plus institutional capacity development. Those are emerging is really needed to address the constraint of the inadequate coordinated mechanisms are in place in the country. So this is our experience from Cambodia. Thank you.
Anupam?
Thank you, Shimako. So building on what Shimako said, we all know that that influencing policy to promote effective climate response is a complex and challenging endeavor, and the feedback loop from evaluation, policy action to appropriate response is longer and even more complex, and not very straightforward. And in general, data on policy influence is very limited. So based on our multiple evaluations that we have worked on, I have summarized few of the bottlenecks coming out of these evaluation. And the first one, and these are not in order, but first one chimes with Shimako's last point on lack of capacity established institutions. When we talk about policy, for instance, when you talk about environmental policy, it might not be coherent with policies from other sectors because there's no coordinating mechanism. The ministries are not working in coordination. They still work in silos. So there's definitely a lack of capacity, but also lack of institution that can bring it together. And we've seen where this has happened, when there has been more interministerial coordination units, programs have yielded a little better results. That one. And the second one is, of course, the complex nexus of environment and economic and political interest, long-term versus short-term. Environmental choice might not be very populist. I have seen policy document being signed when an outgoing president is just about to leave office, he signs off the document, a classic example from one evaluation finding, because these choices also need to disrupt the way behaviors work or the economic system works, so that these choices might not be very populist. Also, communication and outreach capabilities. So most of the time, our evaluation recommendations are very, are complex and not very easy to translate into actions. And so that remains a challenge. And more so, the climate or the environment jargons and the definitions are very difficult for policymakers to understand. So we need to kind of bring it to their level. Also, related bottleneck is the technological and scientific uncertainty and language barriers. So how do you explain these complex scenarios or climate scenarios or environmental scenario to people who make these policies? So that's also quite challenging. And of course, the financial constraint, and that's why we have GCF and we have the German government and Jeff, because all these policies building and policy action need a lot of finance, especially in developing country. So that has also been a constraint and a bottleneck in promoting policies that could address climate change. So I'll just stop at that. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you. So we heard at least 5 reasons, 5 bottlenecks. So the first is the finance available, Anupam pointed out, and also not only total finance available, but how it is distributed. Are the most vulnerable getting what they need? And there seems to be, as Sven pointed out, there seems to be some challenges on that score, and Daisuke also pointed out that. The second bottleneck that we see is knowledge gaps. We are not up to par with adaptation knowledge, as Sven pointed out. Mitigation, there is plenty of information, but climate adaptation part is a relatively younger field, and solutions are fragmented. Each agency may have its own understanding of what works, even that is sparse, but then the fact that we don't bring them together adequately poses further challenge. So, and the third part that we see is, we heard from several speakers here, is the capacity, institutional capacity to implement the plans, and how Shimako pointed out the challenges in getting, even though you may have a plan, the challenges in getting them implemented remains a problem. And then the fourth part that we have to see is the coordination that is needed to bring action to fruition. Multiple sectors, multiple ministries are involved, so climate response to become useful, it requires a lot of coordination and ensure that coherence is there. And finally, the most important part is, do we have the will, the government or the national commitment to overcome these barriers and get action bear fruit? So these are some of the things that you heard here. And we open the floor for any observations. We can, as I said, we can take 2 at this point. We are running quite late in the game, but 2, please, Manny.
Manny Jimenez, IED. I had a question for Sven, but it might be also good to get views from the international organizations about this. And my question is why? You said that German aid tended to go more to countries that didn't perhaps need it as much. And I wonder if you could reflect on just why that is. Is it because that they didn't know? Or is it because of there's geopolitical reasons? Or thirdly, the paradox of aid. Anupam mentioned that those countries who are most likely to spend well are those who have better governance. But those tend not to be countries that are most at risk. So I was just wondering if you could reflect on that.
All right, very good one. And now we need one more. Okay, please.
Maybe I can talk loudly enough. Actually, I have sort of 2 questions. One is piggybacking on the point that Manny made, and I'm wondering about instrumentality, about whether this is through budget support, providing general financing to the Treasury and Ministry of Finance, or project support, the national versus subnational level. Is that influencing uptake and impact? Second question is how you may be linking this to natural GDP and rethinking the way that we calculate
Thank you. Can we wait until the end? We are running short of time, so if you can answer this first, and then I apologize. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Well, you have to go first because you've been asked.
Yeah, but please add. Mani, yeah, you're absolutely right, and thank you for that question. So it's because the German Ministry of Economic and Development Cooperation, they have multiple targets, right? So climate vulnerability is not the only target for aid allocation. There are like human rights, and then it's also sort of performance indicators, democracy. So we have got like, I don't know how many policy priorities there are, but there are tons of them. So the problem is the multiplicity of targets, and that vulnerability is just one of them. So they know. They know, and it is a target, but it's just one among many. And what we saw in other allocation analyses is that actually the geopolitical aspect is one of the most important factors that explains German aid spending, but not only German. So other bilaterals do that as well. In terms of instruments, we looked at, and we didn't find any significant difference between instruments. So far I can, yeah.
Anyone else wants to chip in?
I'd like to reflect on Mark's question on rethinking GDP. So this is very much in discussion, even at the COP for the biodiversity. The natural capital accounting is a big objective and goal, and one of the CBD targets. But it's a very difficult discussion because you're trying to disrupt the whole the traditional economics work, and it's very difficult to convince the finance ministers about these. One good example that I can cite is from Uganda, where the finance minister was convinced, and they tried to embed some natural capital considerations into their financial planning. But overall, I think we are in very nascent stage, and we have a long way to go in measuring and embedding the natural asset into the economic planning and economic systems. For instance, if you have mangroves, I mean, how much money does it save as a nature-based solution from disaster? So we need to value those for the benefits they bring, the cost of water, the cost of clean air, the cost of treating so many sick people because of the air pollution. So there are a lot of discussion these days on these issues, and they have fed into the highest level of, I would say, discussions at the COP. But I think we have a long way to go to see that happen on the ground. Thanks.
Thank you. With that, we will move on to the third question. The role of evaluations to promote green policies that effectively address climate change. Once again, the role of future evaluations, or even the ongoing evaluations, to promote green policies that effectively address climate change. Over to Sven. Who wants to take it first? Anupam? I can go first. Okay.
Just quickly, I believe evaluation could contribute to identifying gap between national development policy strategy and the climate agenda or issue of the country. Also, evaluation could provide global evidence of the best practice or good practices to mainstreaming greening development policies. Yesterday we discussed effectiveness of joint evaluation to assess the global agenda. Probably we can mobilize the intel or knowledge from many evaluators all over the world to conduct a joint synthesis evaluation to collect the good practices and the evidence to analyze the gap between the national development strategy and the climate agenda in the country, and then identify the gap these two national agenda and the global agenda, and then provide some lesson learned. This is my quick observation.
Marco?
Yeah, may I supplement the SK mentioned? Actually, joint evaluation is one good way. Each evaluation team from different institutions might have a different level of the commitment, but also scale of the size of evaluation. But jointly, for example, IED had a joint evaluation with IFAD recently, and also Islamic Development Bank, so on. So we can address with a wider scope of evaluation. Admittedly, it takes a little bit more time or process, and one of the important of the evaluation is to deliver or disseminate our findings or learning very timely to the audience. So that's a sort of trade-off between joint evaluation and also timely dissemination of the knowledge. Another supplementary way, I would say more two-way evaluation from ideally from the our MDB or development partner evaluation, and also with evaluation from on the ground from direct beneficiaries. To do that, we need a little bit more, as Sven mentioned, more knowledge or local assessment, and which can be supported or engaged by research or university of each country to bring more credible information, so that it's still a long way to go, but still two-way communication, two-way evaluation from different directions, not only from different partners of the top-down. Probably that is maybe hopefully in the next future, I hope. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anupam?
So we all know that the potential of evaluations, and sometimes we talk about what evaluations can do. They can help identify the gap in the policy. They can help look at the effectiveness of policy. But I would like to highlight two areas where we can do better as evaluators, and building on the tools and techniques and methods and approaches and the understanding of the science of evaluation, also the art of evaluation. So one area I think as evaluators we can do more is use of more innovative approaches in evaluation, not only for ex post evaluations, but also ex ante. So why wait for something to take place and then wait for 5-6 years to look at their effectiveness? Why not provide more innovative tools, more predictive tools where in hands of decision making makers, so that they know what's going to be the impact. So one such example where we have seen very successful uptake is ex ante evaluation, and this is in Kenya, just one example. So where you see here that not only we are measuring the effectiveness of the protected area in terms of carbon sequestration for the years that have passed, but also projecting it for future. And this can be done for different business situations. So what if you have rapid infrastructure development? How would this look like? How would this look like if you had a very strict conservation? So you're providing these tools, and these are the tools from evaluations. For this we collaborated with NASA, but these kind of analyses are relatively very easy to conduct. So that's one. And the second point I wanted to make quickly is about targeted communication and outreach. And this kind of comes from a reflection of yesterday's session where Jeff was speaking, that we go to our constituents, or we go rather than inviting them. So the similar approach applies in evaluation. So if we want to go to the policymakers, we need to speak their language. We need to communicate in the language they understand. Many a times, sorry to say, they do not work because of conscience. I mean, that's the reality of the world. But they would fear the consequence. If we tell that there would be a flood, there will be increased disaster, they would listen to these kind of messages more. So I think we need to communicate in the language they understand. The evaluation languages, I'm sorry, could be very complex, could be very targeted to our audience. Yesterday I was criticized that for saying that our chief mandate is to report to the GCF Council, which is the mandate. But I was told that, okay, no, your chief mandate is to serve the people and the beneficiary, which is also true. I fully agree. But there are institutional mandate that we have to serve, and we have to articulate the recommendations and finding in those words. But I think we can go beyond that. I'm not talking about like advocacy in a sense, but I think our communication could be catered better for the policymakers. With that, I'll stop here. Over to you.
Oops. Thank you. Thank you so much. So you heard two parts of the story. First, please, Sven. I do beg your pardon. Go ahead.
I don't have many points left. I thought coming last would make my job easier, but it makes it harder. So because many good points were raised. So fully agree with Chimako. That was my point about working together, joint evaluations, but also, you know, there are lots of knowledge repositories out there. You know, the 3IE. Also for OECD member countries and MDBs, the OECD has a repository of evaluation. So if we all make sure that what we can publish, that it's also being uploaded and located in repositories, that will sort of make our job later on to find evidence a lot easier. And also, I'm not being paid by 3IE yet. Maybe money you can call your your previous colleagues. But I mean, evidence and gap maps are a really important tool. And you know, on adaptation, when we did the gap map, it was quite staggering which big gaps we have. GCF is really great in doing evidence and gap maps. If you have money, not money is on money with in terms of dollars, cash. But if you have money, he knows about evidence and gap maps. And if you have financial resources, I would invite you to commission them. It's a really important tool for the community to fill those knowledge gaps. So that's one. I had a point on sort of becoming more useful ex ante evaluation using Bayesian process tracing. The work by McCarthy and Humphrey is really cool. It's a bit complicated methodologic-wise, but real-time evaluations and stuff like that will help. But I guess my main point here is when I saw this conference theme, I was like, great, Asian Evaluation Week in person, amazing, love to go. But then I thought, innovation, isn't that a bit outdated? Because the space I've been working in the last couple of years, they talk about at least transition or just transition or transformation. So my question is, maybe we as evaluator and in future conferences, we may need to think about innovation to what end, right? Innovation with what impact in mind, and is innovation really enough, or do we really, in facing the climate crisis, do we not really need to help our colleagues to transform business? Because IPCC is really clear. I mean, if thousands of scientists agree on sort of transformation is the key, I'm wondering what we as evaluators can do to support that. And so there's some interesting work out there by CIF, for instance, on transformational change. And last point, as you already gave me the minute sign, is I think we can actually and we should integrate climate change concerns in every evaluation, and it's feasible. If you look at the work by Andy Rowe, Patricia Rogers, they have some on footprint evaluations. There's some good points where you can start small. You know, you don't need to do a big evaluation. It doesn't need necessarily to increase costs. So I would appeal to all of you. You know, when you're working as a consultant and you receive terms of reference, give a little pushback and say, can't we add that little extra question? Will cost you not that much more if you're designing evaluations. Take Patricia's work into account, or take the OECD DAC guidance into account, so that we integrate climate change in all of our work. With that, thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that we have 10 minutes. Much shorter than what we had anticipated. But to sum up what we have discussed here in terms of way forward, at least I see two patterns. One is to improve the evaluation's relevance. So you can improve the relevance of the evaluations by having ex-ante kind of evaluation, introducing techniques, process tracing, and so on and so forth, make them more exciting by, if possible, have real-time evaluations, as Sven pointed out. All those things are possibility, increase the relevance of the evaluation. And also, it was pointed out the need to integrate environmental considerations in all evaluations. IFAD actually does this for the last 10 years. So that should be a part of what we need to do. Whatever your action is, what are the environmental consequences, what are the climate adaptation consequences, that has to be part of the evaluation, which will make the evaluation more relevant to policymaking and so on. The second part, in addition to the relevance, we have to increase the voice and reach of evaluations. It is not just enough for us to produce it, but we have to do it in a way that it becomes more visible. Joint evaluations was pointed out by Daisuke and echoed by Shimako. So these are important parts. They are not the only parts that are necessary. Local evaluations were pointed out by Shimako to promote local evaluations to increase the reach. And Sven pointed out, how do we, after the evaluations, we had to pool the knowledge together. It is, climate doesn't know whether I'm from IFAD or whether I'm from DVAL. The solutions also should not be a matter of where I am from, but rather it should be a global or national or regional public good. It has to be brought together, and it has to be brought together, as Daisuke pointed out, not only at the national level, but also at the global level. So COP, for instance, we don't have a collective evaluative voice in COP. There are several side events that are happening there. None of them are dedicated to evaluative evidence, for instance. So why can't we have a collaborative effort that will throw us up there as united as evaluators across the globe, across organizations, across countries, to bring out the message of what are the climate considerations that need to be addressed immediately. So these are some of the things that are coming up here. And now we leave the floor open so that, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Bantirong from Cambodia, Ministry of Economy Finance. I have 2 points. Number one is about this subject topic. Number three, or question number three. I didn't hear you talking about PIMA and CPIMA. Was climate public investment assessment. That is one tool that you see have used, I think, by the IMF, but I did not hear you talking about that. So can you elaborate whether CPIMA is also relevant to the climate, resilience activities? That's number one. Number two, I go back to question number two, that you did not allow me to talk. I saw also the presentation on Cambodia regarding, the assistance from the ADBs and from others. I thank, all the partners to help Cambodia. But one thing I think that the presentation should be updated, that we invited we have a public investment management reform strategy, which we invited PIMA and CPIMA in 2019. It was adopted, this strategy was adopted to reform our public investment management in Cambodia. So we invited PIMA to do the assessment in 2019. But recently, I think last year, we also invited PIMA, IMF, to dispatch the mission and with the new tool of CPIMA, Climate PIMA. So PIMA and Climate PIMA, CPIMA, to do the assessment and bring forward the recommendation to mainstream climate in our public investment cycle, management cycle.
Thank you.
So this should be updated.
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Any more comments, observations? Please keep it brief. Those who haven't asked first, anybody else who, okay, please go ahead. Yep.
Okay. Maybe a comment out of the box. One thing that I wonder as an evaluator is usually when we get the terms of reference and you go into these evaluations, we are meant to evaluate the project as it has been planned, right? And I feel I always get a lot of resistance the moment I say something about the way the program actually has been planned, right? So I'm just supposed to evaluate whether what has been planned has been done in an adequate way, et cetera, whereas I fundamentally usually notice that our planning methodologies are wrong, right? And I do get tired over the decades maybe, right, to see that a lot of things that we know take place are not taken into consideration, right? And I think it is maybe our lack of capacity to actually conduct complex analysis, right? And I think complexity science has advanced to a certain level where I believe that we should all know that you cannot predict results, right? If you have a complex system that depends on behaviors, effectively you have to be prepared for different outcomes. But we have possibilities to simulate that before we go into our project planning, right? So why don't we just simulate what could happen, right? And then structure our projects in a way that they can deal with the interference from the political side, right, with the difficulties that we have with convincing the stakeholders, with the people in Africa that are rotating, moving out of the positions, right? All of these things can be worked on, and then we can work with scenario techniques, yeah, to just get a much higher level of planning, yeah, in our programs, yeah, and I wonder whether we as evaluators then should maybe comment also on the planning processes that we're witnessing and not only look at the contents of the program and then brand the team high marks, low marks, whatever. Yeah, but I think it is related to our linear tradition that we have in planning.
Very good point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We find it difficult to work with complexity.
All right. Are there any other comments, observations, questions? None. Okay. So who wants to take the first one?
Sorry, one more comment from me. During this forum, thank you so much for inviting us in this forum. As SEEDS, although we may be the same, but we are different in various ways. I'm sure that you understand that, Mr. Takahashi. I cannot speak on behalf of my other colleagues from the Pacific Islands, but I'll just talk on Fiji. During COVID, we were struck by a number of tropical disasters. Right now, we have around 32 communities that needs to be relocated, and we have 18 critical communities that urgently needs to be relocated right now, and we don't have funding for this. So I would like you to reconsider the regional approach, because I understand that the GCF accreditation takes 5 years to expire. So the process is quite cumbersome for us to complete, and then given that just 5 years, we may have only 2 years or just a year once we get accredited to complete the projects, and then try to get re-accredited for another period of 5 years. So I just feel that the process for GCF is quite cumbersome, and I can only speak for my country, Fiji, not from the other Pacific Islands. As we have mentioned, we've heard during the workshop, one size does not fit all, so I hope that you'll consider us separately in this context. We may be SIDS, but we have different challenges as well as various different constraints that we faced. Also, we have different cultures as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe the third question, I think it'll be best, given that we have almost run out of time, it is less than a minute we have. Bilaterally, if GCF and you can talk together, it'll be great. And we have, if we can go over 1 minute, who wants to take the question 1 on the climate public assessment, as well as the, when designs go wrong, how do we evaluate? Over.
I can be really brief. I mean, CBIMA, it's a useful tool. My point was that it's not the lack of tools, right? Also, as we saw yesterday from you guys, right? I mean, you've got tons of tools. It's whether they're used and whether the usage has consequences. That's the challenge. On the point of TRs, absolutely. I think we should push back, and sort of the reformed OECD DAC criteria, for instance, give us also the room to do this. But I would add another challenge that we often face is that it's also thinking about what has not been done. So evaluating a program, a strategy, a project is fine, but what alternatives were there, and what kind of other things could have been done. So that goes, of course, into sort of efficiency analysis, but thinking about potential alternatives. Last, just on SIDS and Fijis, I presented the results of our evaluation to the German Parliament. Parliament requested the ministry to take funding to SIDS into more serious consideration and make sure that they stick, that they comply with their own strategy to increase funding to SIDS. Not sure whether it's going to happen, but at least sort of there is some momentum. Thank you.
Okay, we come to an end. I want to thank you all, audience, for taking.
If you allow me, very quickly, thank you for the Cambodia Minister of Finance pointing out. Actually, I was aware, I had a chat with my colleagues who are in charge of the Cambodia, this TA, last night, and I wish my presentation was a little bit more visual, but trying to put a lot of information, but yeah, after I submitted, so I couldn't. But thank you for pointing out. And quickly for the Fiji one, ADB has geared to the more strengthening the regional approach in the last almost 5 years to integrate in our country. I mean, normally ADB has a country strategy, but in the Pacific case, more we have developed a more regional strategy approach. And probably regional hub would be, as Daisuke pointed out earlier, regional approach is one way. And also, yeah, that's just a few comments from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you for coming the last day, early in the morning, and listening to us. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for AEW for giving us the space to present this discussion, and thanks for the panelists and everyone here for making it a lively discussion. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Just a quick announcement from the Secretariat. May we please request attendees to return the headset that was used for translation, and kindly proceed to the ballroom foyer for AM snacks. Thank you.